This is a story that takes place in a peaceful small town in Derry, where everything seems to be peaceful and without any suspicious things. However, behind the smiles and warm lights, a sinister plot has been meticulously planned, leading to events that plunge the whole town into a spiral of horror. An ordinary man, William Dankesreiter with a gentle appearance, was accused of setting an elaborate trap to harm his wife, just because of greed for a $300,000 insurance money with dark plots. The journey to uncover the truth is not only a legal battle, but also a psychological struggle between good and evil, between faith and doubt. So what really happened? What secrets are waiting to be revealed? Join me in this mysterious and dramatic story. Derry Township had always seemed like the picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, a place where everyone knew each other's name, where lawns were neatly trimmed and where the hum of everyday life carried on like clockwork. On the outside, the Dankesreiter home fit in perfectly. A two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a backyard that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of house that could belong to anyone except the people who lived inside. William Dankesreiter had always been an ordinary man, or so it seemed. At 63, he had the appearance of a man who had spent years in the same small town, his features lined with age, his hair thinning at the temples. His clothing was neat but plain, a man who never felt the need to stand out. But there was something about his eyes, cold, calculating, hidden behind a mask of routine. William had lived in Derry Township for most of his life, but recently there had been a subtle shift, a shift he had made with intention. Laura Dankesreiter, his wife of 30 years, was a woman of contrasts. At 59, she had once been vibrant, full of life, her laughter ringing through the halls of their home like music. But over the years, the vibrancy had dimmed, replaced with a quiet, subdued mannerism. She wasn't the same woman she used to be, and neither was William. They had both changed, but it was clear that William's transformation had been the most noticeable. Laura's once bright eyes now seemed hollow, searching for meaning in a life that felt increasingly like a charade. It was a Saturday morning, and like many Saturday mornings before, the sun had already begun to climb high in the sky, spilling golden light into their kitchen as Laura prepared breakfast. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sizzling of bacon on the stove, the rhythmic sound of eggs cracking into a bowl filling the air. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal. A careful, almost methodical routine that they had followed for years, now tinged with the sense that something was on the verge of changing. William sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the newspaper. He didn't say much, just the occasional grunt of acknowledgement as Laura passed him a cup of coffee. His eyes weren't on the paper, at least not really. They were focused somewhere else, distant, as if the words printed on the page meant nothing compared to what was brewing in his mind. "How's the garden coming along?" Laura asked, trying to break the silence. She often asked him about the garden. It was one of the few things they still shared, planting flowers, trimming the bushes, tending to the yard. It had once been their escape, their joint project. But now, even that felt strained. "Good," William muttered, his voice low, almost absent. His fingers lightly traced the rim of his coffee cup, as if trying to distract himself from the thoughts swirling in his mind. Thoughts that were becoming more and more dangerous by the day. Laura had noticed the change in him for months. He wasn't the same man she had married. He had grown distant, almost cold, as if the warmth of their love had been replaced by something darker. She'd caught him staring at her sometimes, a look in his eyes that made her skin crawl. It wasn't love anymore, it was something else, something much harder to define. "Are you still seeing that woman?" Laura had asked him, her voice trembling but steady. It was a question she had asked more than once, and each time she could feel her heart breaking just a little more. William didn't flinch, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. There was a pause, an uncomfortable silence before he answered, his voice flat. "Don't be ridiculous, Laura." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that her suspicions were just her imagination running wild. But something inside her refused to ignore the signs. She wasn't blind. She had seen the messages on his phone, the late-night phone calls that were abruptly ended when she walked into the room. She had heard the whispered conversations in the other room, the hushed tone that made her blood run cold. But it was that look in his eyes, the way he watched her now, that made her question everything. There was a darkness there, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, and for the first time in their marriage, she began to feel afraid of the man she had once loved. She had tried to talk to him about it, to confront him, but William always deflected, always had an excuse. It wasn't that he was hiding something. No, of course not. But the lies piled up one after another until Laura could no longer tell where the truth ended and the deception began. In the mornings, they would sit together at the kitchen table, their conversations growing shorter, their smiles more strained. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was oppressive, heavy. Laura didn't know what to do with it anymore. She couldn't understand why things had gone this far, why the man she had once shared everything with now seemed so unreachable. By the time the weekend rolled around, William had already set his plan into motion. It hadn't come suddenly. No, this was something he'd been thinking about for months, perhaps even longer. The anger, the resentment, the dull ache of dissatisfaction with everything about his life. It all built up to this moment. William had never been a man of grand gestures, but this was different. This would be the defining act that would free him from the bonds of a marriage he had long outgrown. He spent hours working on his plan, a meticulous, careful construction that no one could have suspected. He'd always been good with his hands. While Laura was in the kitchen, focusing on her routine, William quietly disappeared into the basement, where he kept his tools and equipment. He had already been to the local hardware store, buying a variety of materials under the guise of just another mundane project. But behind the innocuous purchases, like eye screws, fishing line, and other seemingly harmless items, lay the sinister purpose that had been simmering in his mind. The basement was cold and dark, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging overhead. The smell of dust filled the air as he knelt over the workbench, his hands trembling with a mix of excitement and anticipation. He had to make sure everything was perfect. Laura had no idea that the very space she walked through every day was becoming the setting for her potential demise. He had carefully measured the length of the fishing line, ensuring it would be taut enough to trip her without alerting her to its presence. The tension in the line needed to be just right, too loose, and it wouldn't work, too tight, and it would snap before she had the chance to fall. This was the precision he had in mind. The plan was simple, yet effective. As she made her way down the basement stairs, the line would catch on her foot, sending her crashing down into the unforgiving concrete below. William ran his fingers over the knot in the fishing line one last time. It had to be perfect, the knot that would bring everything together, the final piece that would set the trap in motion. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the space one last time. The stairs were narrow, leading down to the basement where old boxes and forgotten items were stored. But now, the only thing in the path of the stairs was his trap. Later that afternoon, Laura was in the garden, as she often was when the weather permitted. The fresh air did little to ease the unease that had been growing inside her. She had felt something shift in William, something dark, something threatening, but she couldn't put her finger on it. He had been distant, colder than usual, and every time she caught him staring at her, it felt like his eyes were searching for something, a weakness, a vulnerability. She brushed off the feeling, as she had done so many times before, but the gnawing doubt lingered. Her thoughts kept returning to the basement, to that place where William spent so much of his time tinkering with various projects, fixing broken things, building things she didn't understand. The sound of tools clanging and metal scraping against metal was familiar to her, but lately it had been unsettling. William had always been so secretive about what he was doing down there, and when she asked him, he would simply brush her off. "Just fixing a few things," he would say with a forced smile. But there was something in his voice that didn't sit right. The evening fell like any other, quiet and calm. Laura entered the house, her arms full of freshly picked flowers from the garden. She smiled faintly at the simplicity of it all, but as she stepped inside, the atmosphere felt different. The house seemed quieter than usual. William was sitting at the kitchen table, the paper in front of him, but his attention was elsewhere. His eyes weren't on the headlines, they were focused on something deeper, on her. Laura set the flowers on the counter, casting a quick glance toward him. He said nothing, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. Something in the air had shifted, but she couldn't quite identify what. "I'll be downstairs for a bit," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Got some stuff to finish up." Laura nodded, trying to ignore the unease building in her chest. She had to be careful. Something was wrong, and the feeling was unmistakable. She stood there for a moment, staring at the hallway that led to the basement door, wondering if she should follow him. But she hesitated. As the night wore on, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that William was hiding something from her. The house was unusually quiet, No sounds of him working in the basement, no footsteps in the hall, just silence. And the longer she stood there, the more she felt a deep, unshakable dread settle in her gut. She made up her mind. She would check on him. She couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion any longer. As she walked toward the basement door, her hand trembling slightly, she heard it. The faintest sound. A creaking, as if the house itself were groaning under some unseen weight. She paused, straining her ears. It was coming from downstairs. The sound of something, someone, moving. But there was no light under the door, no indication that William was down there. She tried to push the thought away, but it didn't work. The moment Laura stepped into the basement, she would feel the tension shift. She wouldn't see it at first, the invisible danger that hung in the air, ready to strike. But the silence was almost deafening, and the world around her would begin to slow as she took each cautious step toward the stairs. The trap was set, but it hadn't been sprung yet. The basement door creaked as Laura pushed it open. The smell of old wood and dust hit her immediately, mingling with the faint metallic scent of something else, a sharp, almost chemical odor she couldn't place. She hesitated for a moment, the unease within her growing stronger. But she stepped inside nonetheless, her hand reaching for the railing as her feet descended the stairs. It was quiet down here. Too quiet. The usual sounds of William's work, tools scraping, metal clinking, were absent. All that remained was the dim light from a single overhead bulb that illuminated the narrow staircase leading down to the basement floor. The light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she felt the weight of the silence pressing in around her. Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she continued downward, each step bringing her closer to the source of the strange tension she couldn't escape. She still wasn't sure why she had come down here, why she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but her instincts pushed her forward. Something about the stillness of the house had been unsettling, like a storm brewing just out of sight, waiting to break. As she reached the bottom step, she glanced around, looking for any sign of William. She called his name softly, her voice tentative. "William?" There was no answer. The air felt heavy, as if the very space between the walls was thick with unspoken thoughts. Laura stood there for a moment, her gaze darting to the far corner of the room where old boxes were stacked haphazardly. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, her breath catching in her throat. Then it happened. A sudden, sharp tug caught her by surprise. Her foot was yanked forward, and before she could react, she stumbled. A loud, deafening crack echoed through the basement as the back of her knee hit the edge of a step. The fishing line, stretched taut across the stairway, caught her by surprise. Her body pitched forward, her arms flailing as she lost her balance. Laura screamed as she plummeted, her hands reaching out instinctively, but there was nothing to grab, no railing to steady herself. She crashed down onto the cold, unforgiving concrete, her body twisting awkwardly as she fell. Pain shot through her side, and for a split second, the world spun around her. She lay there, stunned, unable to catch her breath, her vision blurring as the shock of the fall overtook her senses. The smell of dust and damp concrete was sharp in her nostrils, and the floor beneath her felt like ice. She could taste the metallic tang of blood in her mouth, her lips cut from the impact. She had barely had a moment to process what had just happened when she heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, too calm. William. Her heart raced as she pushed herself into a sitting position, her hands trembling as she tried to push herself off the cold floor. Her body screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop now. She had to get away. She had to understand what was happening. What was he doing? Why would he do this? The basement door creaked open and she looked up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. William stood there, framed by the doorway, his expression unreadable. The dim light from above cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look almost monstrous. His eyes were cold, calculating, no trace of remorse, no concern for the woman who had been his partner for 3 decades. "Well," he said, his voice eerily calm, "looks like you've fallen." Laura tried to push herself to her feet, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her body refused to obey, the pain in her side flaring with each movement. She couldn't stand, couldn't run. She was trapped. What did you do?" Laura's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the pounding in her head. William didn't answer at first. He just stood there watching her. There was no hint of guilt in his eyes, no sign of hesitation. He had done this, and he was watching it unfold, as if it were a well-rehearsed play. "You should have seen it coming, Laura," he said softly, almost like he was explaining something simple. "It was always going to end like this. You just didn't want to believe it." Laura's breath hitched as the truth began to sink in. This wasn't an accident. This was no fall. It was planned. It was all planned. "The rope!" she gasped, her eyes widening as she turned toward the stairs. You set this up." William smiled faintly, a cold, hollow smile. "It's the only way, Laura. The only way to make sure this ends. No more lies, no more pretending. I've wanted out for so long." Laura's mind raced, her thoughts clouded by the suddenness of the attack. She tried to move, but her body refused to cooperate, each movement sending waves of pain coursing through her. Her mind was a blur, but the pieces began to come together. The tension, the coldness, the silence, the fishing line, it all made sense now. You tried to kill me," she breathed, her voice breaking. William's gaze softened, but it wasn't out of regret. It was pity. "It's not personal, Laura. You never understood. But it's time to stop pretending, don't you think?" He stepped closer to her, his boots making no sound on the floor. Laura's pulse quickened, fear flooding her chest. He was too close. She could feel his presence like a weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. This was it. This was the moment when everything had changed. And yet, as she lay there, broken and unable to move, a part of her knew she wasn't done yet. She couldn't be. She wouldn't let him win. But in that moment, as she looked up at the man she had once loved, she realized one terrifying truth. Laura's breath was shallow, her chest heaving with each desperate gasp. She tried again to push herself up, her hands trembling, but the pain was unbearable. Every part of her body felt like it was on fire. The fall had broken something inside her, both physically and emotionally. William watched her with an unsettling calmness. He didn't rush to help her, didn't seem bothered by the fact that she was lying there, vulnerable and broken. No, he stood as though he were admiring a painting, coldly taking in the scene. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, as Laura's mind scrambled to make sense of it all. "Why?" she finally managed to croak, her voice raw and cracked. Her eyes searched his face for some sign, any sign of the man she had once known. He took a step forward, and Laura flinched instinctively. She couldn't help it. The man she had shared her life with was standing there, cold and distant, as if the love they had once shared never existed at all. William crouched down in front of her, his face now mere inches from hers. His breath was cool against her skin, and Laura recoiled instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. "You didn't see it, but I did," he said, his eyes burning with a strange intensity. "I saw it all. The way we grew apart, the way you stopped seeing me, really seeing me. You were too wrapped up in your own little world, too busy with your own problems to notice how much I was suffering." Laura's mind spun with his words. "Suffering?" William smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, calculated. "I didn't think you did, Laura, but I had to make a choice, and I chose freedom." His eyes never left hers as he spoke, as if daring her to challenge him. "You didn't love me anymore. You loved the idea of me, the version of me that you wanted to keep alive. But that man died a long time ago." The words were like a punch to the gut. Laura's mind was reeling, but something inside her snapped. This wasn't just about a failed marriage. This was something far darker. William wasn't just a man who had given up on love. He had given up on everything. His life, his future, his very sense of self had been swallowed by his need for control. His desire for a life free of the very woman he had once vowed to love. William's smile widened, his eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. "It was never about killing you, Laura. It was about getting rid of the dead weight. You were just standing in the way of what I really wanted, and I'm not sorry for it." He straightened up, stepping back from her as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience. "You never understood me, Laura. You never understood the lengths I was willing to go to, but now you do. Now you finally see the truth." Laura felt something inside her snap. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about getting away from him. This was about exposing him, about making sure that his twisted reality didn't swallow her whole. "No," she breathed, her voice growing stronger despite the pain. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to destroy me. I'm not going to let you get away with it." William's expression faltered for a moment, and for the first time, Laura saw a flicker of something like doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to fight back. He had expected her to cower, to beg for mercy, to accept his twisted justification. The tension in the air was thick. Every breath that Laura took was a battle against the weight of the reality she had just uncovered. It felt as if the entire world had shifted beneath her feet, and the foundation of her life, everything she thought she knew, had crumbled to dust. William stood there, still the calm, cold figure in front of her, his expression unreadable. But she could feel the shift. He had underestimated her, and now that fatal mistake would be his undoing. "You're a monster," Laura said, her voice trembling but sharp, each word cutting through the silence. "All these years, I thought you were just lost, but you've always been this way, haven't you? You've been planning it, plotting it, pretending to love me, when all along you were just waiting to take it all." William didn't react immediately. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed on hers as if measuring her, as if contemplating what his next move should be. It was clear now. He had no answers, no apologies. There was no remorse in his eyes, only the calculating look of someone who believed he had already won. "I don't need to explain myself to you, Laura," he said, his voice cold, dismissive. "You're just another casualty in my plan, a casualty of the choices I had to make. I'm doing what I need to do, and nothing is going to change that." Laura's anger flared. For years, she had been forced to live in his shadow, silenced by his control and manipulation. But now she was no longer that woman, the woman who had stayed in a broken marriage for fear of being alone, the woman who had swallowed her tears and pretended that everything was fine. With one swift motion, Laura reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of her phone. The truth was, she had already taken the first step in reclaiming her life. The moment she had seen through his lies, she had reached out. There was someone who believed her, someone who was already on the way. William's face hardened. For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a crack in the armor he had so carefully built around himself. He took a step toward her, his fists clenched at his sides, but Laura stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. She could hear the sirens in the distance growing louder with each passing second. They were coming. And William knew it. His eyes flickered nervously, but he didn't retreat. He knew the game was over. His plan was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it now. But as the sirens grew closer, William made a final attempt to regain control. He lunged toward her, desperation clouding his actions. Laura didn't flinch. She had anticipated this, had expected it. Before he could reach her, she sidestepped quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. And in that moment, the door to the room creaked open and officers rushed in. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dim room, casting eerie shadows on the walls as they stormed in. "Get down on the ground!" one of them shouted. William's eyes darted to the officers, but his feet remained rooted to the floor. It was as if he couldn't process the finality of it all. His fate had been sealed the moment he had decided to destroy her. "I said, get down!" another officer barked, and with that, William finally dropped to his knees, his hands behind his head. Laura stood there watching, a mix of relief and disbelief flooding her senses. The hours that followed felt surreal. For Laura, it was as though time itself had slowed down, each minute stretching endlessly as she stood there, watching the chaos unfold before her eyes. The police had taken William away, his once confident and cruel demeanor now shattered beyond recognition. She had won, but the victory felt hollow. She had faced him head-on, exposed his lies, and broken free from his grasp. But the scars remained. The house was quiet now, the sound of sirens fading into the distance, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Laura stood in the living room, her back against the wall, her hands still trembling, not from fear, but from the release of a tension that had gripped her for so long. Laura's mind kept racing, her thoughts spinning in a whirlpool of confusion and relief. She had thought that this moment, this final confrontation, would bring an overwhelming sense of closure. But instead, all she could feel was a deep, gnawing emptiness. It was a strange thing, freedom. She had imagined it would feel like a weight lifting from her shoulders, but in reality, it was more like standing on the edge of a precipice, uncertain of what lay ahead. She was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She hesitated for a moment before slowly walking toward it, her heart beating in her chest. When she opened the door, she was greeted by Detective Anderson, the lead investigator on the case. His face was stern, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes. "Miss Dankesreiter," he said, his voice steady, "We've taken Mr. Dankesreiter into custody. He's not going anywhere. You're safe now." Laura nodded, trying to force a smile, but the words didn't bring her the comfort she thought they would. It was over, yes. But what came next? What kind of life could she build after everything she had been through? "I appreciate everything you've done," she replied, her voice quiet. "But I don't know what to do now. I don't know how to move on from this." Detective Anderson gave her a sympathetic look, his expression softening. "It's going to be a long road, Miss Dankesreiter. There's no easy way to heal from something like this, but you're not alone. You have people who care about you. You'll get through it." The words were comforting, but they didn't take away the cold emptiness that had settled in Laura's chest. The truth was, she didn't know how to start over. She didn't know how to trust again, how to rebuild her life after everything had been shattered. The world she had known for so long had crumbled, and she was left to pick up the pieces. She glanced around the room, her eyes falling on the photographs that lined the mantel. They were old, faded memories of happier times, before everything had gone wrong. She had once believed that her life was going to be normal, that she would have a family, a future, just like everyone else. But somewhere along the way, it had all slipped away from her. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until Anderson broke it again. "We'll be in touch," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "But if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Laura nodded, but she didn't say anything more. As the detective left, she closed the door behind him and leaned against it, feeling the weight of the world settle heavily on her shoulders once again. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings with lawyers, and an endless stream of questions from the press. Laura had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable than she did in those moments. It seemed like everyone wanted a piece of her story. Everyone wanted to know the details of what had happened behind the closed doors of her home. But none of it mattered. All the questions, all the attention, it felt hollow. What mattered, what she needed was time. Time to process, to grieve, to heal, and she didn't have the energy for the world's demands right now. One afternoon, as Laura sat in her kitchen sipping a cup of tea, she heard a soft knock on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, so she stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find her best friend Rachel standing on the other side. Rachel's face was full of concern, her eyes searching Laura's face for any signs of distress. Without saying a word, she pulled Laura into a hug, holding her tightly as though she could protect her from everything that had happened. "I'm here," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm here for you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Laura allowed herself to cry. She let the tears fall freely, the weight of everything she had been through pouring out in an uncontrollable wave. Rachel didn't say anything. She just held her, offering the kind of silent support that spoke volumes. It wasn't until later, when the tears had subsided and the storm inside her had calmed, that Rachel spoke again. "You've been through so much, Laura, but you don't have to go through this alone. You have me. You have people who love you. You're going to make it through this." Laura looked up at her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her after all. Maybe with time, she could rebuild piece by piece. It wasn't going to be easy, but with the support of those who truly cared, she might just be able to find her way back to herself. The days passed slowly, but Laura began to piece her life back together, one small step at a time. She avoided the media frenzy, retreating into the quiet sanctuary of her home. But the quiet wasn't always comforting. It often brought back memories she would rather forget. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved, a nagging itch at the back of her mind. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Laura decided to start cleaning the house. She hadn't been in the basement since the night everything unraveled. It was where so much of William's twisted plan had come to light, and the thought of stepping down there made her stomach churn. But she couldn't avoid it forever. She gathered her courage, flicked on the light switch, and descended the creaky wooden stairs. The basement smelled of damp concrete and old wood, a cold and unwelcoming place. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the room. Laura focused on cleaning one section at a time, forcing herself to push through the unease. As she sorted through a box of old files, her hand brushed against something hard and metallic. Curious, she pulled it out and found herself holding a small locked metal box. It was dusty and heavy, the edges worn as if it had been handled frequently in the past. She frowned, trying to remember if she had ever seen it before. It didn't look familiar. The box was locked and there was no key in sight. Intrigued and slightly nervous, Laura brought it upstairs to her kitchen table. She studied it closely, running her fingers over the smooth surface. The lock was small, and she thought she might be able to break it open with a screwdriver. After some fumbling and a few muttered curses, the lock gave way with a satisfying click. Laura hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside, she found a collection of items that sent a chill down her spine: photographs, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be detailed plans. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the photographs. It was a picture of her, taken without her knowledge, sitting in the park near her office. There were more photographs, each one documenting her daily routine, leaving the house, going to work, shopping for groceries. Laura's chest tightened as the realization hit her. William had been watching her for months, if not years, tracking her every move. The notes were equally disturbing, filled with meticulous observations about her habits, schedules, and interactions with others. It was as if he had been preparing for something far beyond what she had already discovered. Among the papers, Laura found a crudely drawn map of their house, with certain areas marked with red X's. One of the marks was over the basement stairs where the tripwire had been set. Another mark was over their bedroom, and another near the garage. Her stomach turned as she realized these were locations where William had likely planned other traps or incidents. At the bottom of the box was a journal. Laura hesitated, her fingers hovering over the leather-bound cover. Did she really want to know what was inside? After a moment's pause, she opened it. The pages were filled with William's handwriting, rambling thoughts and disturbing fantasies. He had detailed his frustrations with her, his anger, and his belief that she was the one ruining their marriage. He had written about how he needed to take control and eliminate the problem. One entry stood out, dated just weeks before the incident with the tripwire. She doesn't see it coming. She thinks she's safe, but no one is safe when they cross me. The plan is almost ready. She'll regret everything. Laura's hands shook as she read the words. The depth of William's hatred, his obsession, and his willingness to harm her was laid bare on the pages. Tears streamed down her face as she realized how close she had come to losing everything. But then, something else caught her attention. At the very back of the journal was a list of names, some of which she recognized as William's co-workers. Others were unfamiliar. Next to each name was a short note: debt, loyal, useful. Laura's brow furrowed. What did this mean? Were these people involved in his schemes? Or were they merely pawns in his twisted games? She couldn't ignore the implications. William's actions had been methodical, calculated, and far-reaching. If there were others who had been complicit or aware of his intentions, they needed to be brought to light. Laura gathered the contents of the box and placed them in a secure folder. She knew she had to take this to Detective Anderson. Whatever this was, it was bigger than just her and William. There was more to uncover, and she wasn't going to stop until she had answers. That evening, Laura sat in her living room, staring at the folder on the coffee table. She felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The discovery of the box had opened a new chapter in this nightmare, one that she hadn't anticipated, but it also gave her a purpose, a reason to keep going. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a survivor, and she was going to make sure that William's web of deceit was unraveled completely. For the first time in weeks, Laura felt a spark of hope. She had faced the darkness and survived. Now she was ready to fight back. The folder sat heavily in Laura's lap as she made her way to the police station. The drive was tense. Every red light felt longer than usual. Every car behind her seemed to loom closer than normal. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with questions. Who were the people on the list? Could any of them have been part of William's plans, or were they just unwitting connections? And most importantly, how much danger was she still in? When Laura arrived at the station, Detective Anderson was already waiting for her. His gruff exterior softened slightly when he saw the expression on her face. "You said it was urgent?" he asked, leading her into an interview room. Laura placed the folder on the table. "I found this in the basement. It's more than I expected. You need to see it." Anderson opened the folder, his eyes scanning the photographs, notes, and journal pages. His expression darkened as he flipped through the contents, his jaw tightening. When he reached the list of names at the back of the journal, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "This is big," he said. "These names, I recognize a few of them. Some are his co-workers, sure, but others, this one here, Martin Crowell, he's been on our radar before. fraud charges, a suspected accomplice in a Ponzi scheme, but we could never pin anything on him. Laura frowned. You think William was working with him? It's possible. Crowell's known for exploiting people, using them for his own gain. If William had debts or needed someone to help fund his plans, Crowell would be the kind of person to turn to. The notes about loyalty and usefulness, it fits. Anderson continued to sift through the evidence. We're going to need to look into all of this. It's not just about William anymore. If he was part of a network, we need to know how deep it goes. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She had thought the nightmare was over, that William's arrest had brought everything to an end. But now it seemed like it was only the beginning. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with the faces and names from the list, the cryptic notes William had written, and the fear that someone else might be watching her. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows before finally collapsing onto the couch. As she stared at the ceiling, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Rachel. Thinking of you. Let me know if you need anything. Laura typed back a quick reply, grateful for Rachel's support, but even that small comfort couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. Somewhere out there, people connected to William might still be plotting, still carrying out their schemes. The next day, Detective Anderson called her back to the station. His tone was serious. We've started digging into the names you gave us. Crowell isn't the only one with a record. Another name, Sheila Watts, has ties to a string of suspicious insurance claims. And then there's Michael Duvall. He works at the same company as William. We found transactions between them that don't make sense. Laura's heart sank. You think they were all working together? Anderson nodded. It's starting to look that way. But we'll need more evidence to make anything stick. For now, we're keeping an eye on them. You should be cautious, Laura. If any of them think you're a threat... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Laura understood the implications. She was a loose end in a tangled web, and loose ends were often cut. Determined not to be a victim again, Laura started taking precautions. She installed security cameras around her home, changed her phone number, and avoided her usual routines. Rachel insisted on staying over some nights, refusing to let her face this alone. Despite the fear, Laura felt a growing resolve. William had tried to control her life, but she wasn't going to let his shadow loom over her forever. She began researching the names on the list herself, poring over articles and public records. What she found only deepened the mystery. Sheila Watts, for example, had filed multiple life insurance claims over the years, each time following the death of a family member under unusual circumstances. Michael Duvall's finances were murky, with unexplained deposits that suggested he was receiving payments from someone. The threads were starting to connect, but the full picture was still unclear. One evening, while scrolling through old emails, Laura stumbled upon something she had overlooked. It was an email from William, sent months before their relationship began to unravel. At first glance, it seemed like a standard work email, but something about it caught her attention. Buried in the text was a reference to a project called Solstice. She had no idea what it meant, but it felt significant. Laura forwarded the email to Anderson, along with a message. The air was thick with tension as Laura parked her car outside the courthouse. Despite her precautions, she had received a chilling message slipped under her door just days earlier. It was a single piece of paper with one word scrawled across it. Stop. There was no signature, no explanation, but its intent was clear. Someone was trying to silence her. Detective Anderson had assured her that her testimony was critical. The deeper they dug into the network William had been entangled with, the more it became clear that Laura held the key to unraveling their operations. Yet, with every step forward, the danger escalated. As Laura walked through the courthouse doors, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Rachel had insisted on accompanying her, and her presence offered some comfort. Together, they climbed the marble steps, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel asked, her voice low. Laura nodded. "If I don't speak up, they win. William may be gone, but the people he worked with aren't. This needs to end." Inside the courtroom, Laura took her place at the witness stand. The prosecutor began by asking her to recount the events leading up to the discovery of William's journal and the incriminating folder. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, a strange calm settled over her. This was her story, and she was determined to tell it. Across the room, the defense attorney, a sharp-eyed man in an immaculate suit, watched her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. When it was his turn to cross-examine, his questions came fast and pointed. "Mrs. Dankesreiter, isn't it true that you and your late husband were going through a contentious divorce?" he asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Yes," Laura replied, meeting his gaze. "But that doesn't change the fact that he tried to kill me. And yet you claim he kept meticulous notes about his supposed crimes? Doesn't that strike you as convenient?" Laura's hands clenched in her lap. "He was arrogant. He thought he was untouchable." The attorney smirked. "Or perhaps you found those notes useful for building your narrative." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Laura's face burned, but she refused to back down. "I didn't need to build a narrative. The truth speaks for itself." The trial has ended with many new details. That evening, as Laura and Rachel returned home, the weight of the day settled heavily on their shoulders. The trial was far from over, and the defense had made it clear that they intended to paint Laura as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge. As Laura prepared a pot of tea, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. Suddenly, she froze. "Laura," she said, her voice tight, "you need to see this." Rachel handed her the phone, where a news article was displayed. It detailed a suspicious fire at the office of one of the individuals from William's list, Michael Duvall. Authorities were investigating it as arson, and while no one had been hurt, the timing was too coincidental to ignore. "They're cleaning up," Laura whispered, "destroying evidence." Rachel nodded grimly. "You need to be careful. If they think you're a threat—" "I know," Laura said, her voice steady, "but I'm not going to let them scare me into silence." The following week brought more revelations. Anderson called Laura to the station to show her the results of their investigation into Solstice. It wasn't just a code name, it was a full-blown operation. Financial records, offshore accounts, and shell companies pointed to a web of criminal activity spanning years. William hadn't been working alone. He had been part of something much larger. "Solstice is tied to everything," Anderson explained, gesturing to a whiteboard covered in names, dates, and connections. "Insurance fraud, embezzlement, even a few disappearances. We're talking about millions of dollars." Laura stared at the board, her stomach churning. "And William was part of this?" "He wasn't just part of it," Anderson said. "He was a key player, and now that he's gone, someone else is trying to cover their tracks." As they spoke, a junior officer approached with a folder. "Detective, we just got this from forensics. It's about the fire at Duvall's office." Anderson opened the folder, his expression darkening as he read. Accelerant was used. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Laura's mind raced. If they were willing to go this far to protect their secrets, how much longer before they came after her directly? That night, Laura's worst fears were realized. She awoke to the sound of glass shattering downstairs. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911 before creeping to the top of the stairs. In the dim light, she could see a figure moving through the living room. "Get out of here!" she shouted, her voice shaking. The intruder froze, then bolted for the door as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. By the time the police arrived, they were gone, but the message was clear. Laura was in their crosshairs. The final days of the trial were a whirlwind. The prosecution presented their case with precision, linking William's actions to the broader network uncovered through the Solstice investigation. Witnesses testified about the financial schemes, the suspicious activities, and the people involved. But it was Laura's testimony that left the strongest impression. She spoke not just of the fear and betrayal she had endured, but of her determination to see justice done. Her words resonated, and when the verdict was finally delivered, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The court found William's accomplices guilty on multiple charges, and the Solstice operation began to crumble. But for Laura, the end of the trial was just the beginning of a new chapter. In the weeks that followed, Laura began to rebuild her life. She moved to a new town, started a new job, and worked to reclaim her sense of peace. Rachel remained a constant presence, their friendship stronger than ever. Though the scars of her ordeal would never fully fade, Laura knew she had done the right thing. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger for it. And as she stood on her porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The power of jealousy and greed can corrode a person's character, turning trust and love into betrayal and deceit. While this case didn't claim a life, its impact was profound, leaving deep scars on trust and the stability of life itself. If you find this story meaningful, Your support would be a tremendous encouragement for me to create even better content. If there's anything you feel could be improved, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps us grow. Thank you for watching, and I'd be incredibly grateful for your subscription to the channel. Your support means the world to me,